The wind cut across the platform like a blade, carrying dust and the smell of coal smoke. Clara Whitmore gripped her worn carpet bag tighter, her knuckles white beneath thin gloves that had seen too many winters. The train behind her hissed and groaned, settling into its temporary rest before continuing west without her. She'd made it. After 3 weeks of rattling cars, stale bread, and sleeping upright with her head against cold windows, she'd finally arrived at Ridgeback, Wyoming territory. The letter in her pocket, now creased and soft from being read 100 times, promised a new start. A husband. A home. Respectability. Mr. Daniel Fortner seeks a practical woman of good character for matrimony. No frills needed, just honesty and hard work. If interested, arrive Ridgeback Station, October 14th. Practical. That word had given her hope. At 34, Clara was past the age when men looked at her with interest. Her hands were rough from years of laundry work, her face lined from worry and sun. But practical. That she could do. That she'd been doing her whole life. The platform was crowded. Families reuniting, merchants collecting shipments, cowboys heading to the saloons that lined Ridgeback's main street. Clara scanned the faces, looking for someone who might be looking for her. The letter hadn't included a photograph, just a description. Tall, dark-haired, clean-shaven. Half the men here fit that description. She set down her bag and waited, trying not to notice how the women in their clean traveling dresses glanced at her patched coat. She'd done her best. Washed her hair that morning in the train's basin, pinned it neat. Wore her only good dress under the coat, the gray wool one that didn't show stains. Clara Whitmore? She turned so fast she nearly tripped on her skirt. A man stood there. Tall, yes. Dark-haired. Yes, but his face wore an expression she couldn't quite read. Behind him stood 3 other men, watching with the focused interest of people about to witness something entertaining. Mr. Fortner? Her voice came out smaller than she'd meant it to. That's right. He looked her up and down, not even trying to hide it. His eyes lingered on her face, her hands, the frayed hem of her coat. The assessment took maybe 10 seconds. It felt like an hour. Then he turned to his friends. No. The word hit her like a fist. I'm sorry? Clara stepped forward, certain she'd misheard. Fortner looked at her again, and this time there was something almost pitying in his expression. Almost, but not quite. I said no, this won't work. Heat flooded Clara's face. Around them, people were starting to stare. A woman in a blue bonnet whispered something to her companion. 2 cowboys by the freight car had stopped their conversation to watch. I don't understand, Clara said, fighting to keep her voice steady. We had an agreement. I came all this way. I was expecting someone younger. Fortner cut her off, not unkindly, but with the finality of a man who'd made up his mind. The advertisement said I wanted a practical woman. I do. But I also need someone who can work hard, bear children, last through hard winters. You look tired. One of his friends laughed, a short, sharp sound quickly stifled. Clara's throat tightened. I can work. I've worked my whole life. The letter didn't mention age. Didn't think I'd need to. Fortner shifted his weight, already looking past her toward the train. Look, I'm sorry you came all this way. That's unfortunate, but I can't marry you. It wouldn't be right, not for either of us. Not right for you, you mean? The words came out harder than she'd intended, but she didn't take them back. Fortner had the decency to look uncomfortable, at least. I'll pay your ticket back, he offered. Wherever you came from. Denver. The word tasted like ash. And I spent everything I had to get here. That wasn't entirely true. She had $7.30 sewn into the lining of her bag. But it was close enough. The ticket back would take all of it. And then what? Back to the boarding house where she'd scrubbed floors? Back to washing other people's sheets until her hands bled? Fortner pulled out his wallet, counted bills. Here, should cover it, plus a meal. Clara stared at the money he held out. $20. More than she'd made in a month back in Denver. It would be easy to take it, easy to get back on that train, admit defeat, disappear. She didn't reach for it. Keep it, she said quietly. Fortner frowned. Don't be stupid. You need... I said keep it. Clara picked up her bag. Her hands shook, but her voice didn't. I didn't come here to be bought off. I came here because your letter promised something. You breaking that promise isn't my fault, and I won't take your charity like it is. The platform had gone quiet. Not completely. Trains were never completely quiet, but quiet enough that her words carried. Quiet enough that the watching crowd grew larger. "Then what are you going to do?" One of Fortner's friends spoke up, a stocky man with a thick mustache. "You got family here, friends?" "No." Clara met his eyes. "But I'll figure it out." "In Ridgeback?" The man laughed. "Lady, there's nothing here for a woman alone. Fortner's doing you a favor, honestly. Take the money, go back to wherever you came from, find some old widower who needs a housekeeper." Something snapped inside Clara's chest. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a small, clean break, like a wire pulled too tight for too long. "I'm 34 years old," she said, loud enough now that people 10 feet away could hear. "Not dead, not useless. I've worked since I was 12, laundry, cooking, cleaning, sewing, nursing sick children through fever. I came here because I wanted a partnership, a life. Not because I was desperate enough to take scraps from men who think a woman's only value is how young and pretty she is." Fortner's face darkened. "Now hold on. I don't need to hold on to anything." Clara's voice shook now, but not with fear, with rage. Pure, clean rage that she'd been swallowing for years. "You put out an advertisement. I answered in good faith. I spent my savings, traveled 3 weeks, and you rejected me in 30 seconds because I'm not what you pictured. Fine. That's your right. But don't stand there and pretend you're doing me a favor by paying me off." She turned to leave, and that's when the whispers started. Unbelievable. Did you hear how she spoke to him? No wonder she's unmarried. Poor Fortner. Imagine opening that letter. Clara kept walking. The platform stretched ahead of her, wooden planks worn smooth by thousands of feet. Beyond it, Ridgeback spread out in dusty streets and false-fronted buildings. She had no idea where she was going. The town had one hotel. She'd seen it from the train window, but even a single night would drain what little money she had left. "Ma'am." A different voice this time, deeper. Clara almost didn't stop, but something in the tone made her pause. She turned. A man stood near the freight car, apart from the crowd. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing work clothes that had seen better days, and a hat pulled low enough to shadow his face. He didn't move toward her, just stood there with his hands loose at his sides. "You need work?" he asked. Clara's first instinct was to say no, to tell him she wasn't that desperate, that she didn't need rescue from some stranger who'd watched her humiliation like everyone else. But she was that desperate, and she did need rescue, even if admitting it felt like swallowing glass. "What kind of work?" she asked carefully. The man pushed his hat back, and she got her first clear look at his face. Older than Fortner, maybe 40, maybe more. Hard-featured, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into sun and wind. A scar ran from his left eyebrow into his hairline, pale against weathered skin. "Ranch work," he said. "Cooking, cleaning, mending. Maybe some help with livestock if you're capable." "I'm capable." The words came out clipped. "What's the pay?" "Room and board, $20 a month." It wasn't much. It was barely anything. But it was more than she had now, and it was honest work. "Where's the ranch?" she asked. "North of here. About 12 miles. The man glanced at the crowd, which was still watching with undisguised interest. "But we should discuss terms somewhere less public." Clara's instincts screamed caution. She didn't know this man. Didn't know anything about him except that he'd appeared at exactly the moment she needed help, which was either providence or predation. "The hotel has a dining room," she said. "We can talk there." Something that might have been respect flickered across the man's face. "Fair enough. I'm Ethan Hale." "Clara Whitmore. I know. Heard the whole thing." He picked up a crate from the freight pile like it weighed nothing. "I'll meet you there in 20 minutes. Need to load my supplies first." He walked away before she could respond, disappearing into the chaos of the freight area. Clara stood there, bag in hand, feeling the weight of 100 stares. Fortner and his friends had moved off, probably to the nearest saloon to laugh about the old mail-order bride who'd gotten uppity. The woman in the blue bonnet was still whispering to her companion, both of them looking at Clara like she was something unfortunate that had washed up on the platform. For a moment, just a moment, Clara wanted to scream, to throw her bag at them, to shout every furious thought that had been building in her chest for the last 10 minutes, to make them see her as something other than a rejected commodity. Instead, she lifted her chin and walked toward the hotel. The Ridgeback Hotel wasn't much. 2 stories of weathered wood with a crooked sign and windows that needed washing. But it had a dining room, and the dining room had tables where a woman could sit without being harassed. Probably. Clara chose a table in the corner, away from the windows. A tired-looking waitress brought her coffee without being asked, and Clara nursed it slowly, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She'd expected nervousness, maybe awkwardness, even disappointment. She knew she wasn't what most men hoped for in a bride, but she hadn't expected such casual cruelty, such public dismissal. And now here she was, about to discuss employment with a complete stranger because the alternative was, what? Sleep in the street? Beg Fortner to reconsider? No. She'd meant what she said on that platform. She wouldn't take his charity, wouldn't grovel for a man who'd looked at her like she was livestock that hadn't met specifications. The coffee was terrible. Clara drank it anyway. Ethan Hale arrived exactly 20 minutes later, hat in hand. Up close, in better light, Clara could see more details. The gray threading through his dark hair, the deep-set eyes that were neither friendly nor unfriendly, just watchful. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who worked hard and had been doing it for a long time. He sat down across from her without invitation, which should have annoyed her, but somehow didn't. "Let me be straight with you," he said, no preamble. "My ranch is failing. Has been for 3 years. I lost my wife to fever, lost my help to better opportunities, and I'm barely keeping my head above water. I need someone who can work hard, keep a house running, and not fall apart when things get difficult, and things will get difficult." Clara set down her coffee cup. "Why are you telling me this? Most employers would dress it up a little. Most employers aren't desperate enough to hire a woman they just watched get rejected on a train platform." Ethan's expression didn't change. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering hard work for fair pay, but I need to know you can handle it." "I can handle it." "You say that now." "I've been handling it my whole life." Clara leaned forward. "You want straight talk? Here it is. I'm 34, unmarried, and I just spent my last dollar getting to a town where nobody wants me. I've got no family, no prospects, and no reason to go back to what I left. So yes, I can handle hard work. I can handle difficult. What I can't handle is being treated like I'm disposable." Ethan studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Fair enough. Here's the arrangement. You work for me. You get your own room in the ranch house, 3 meals a day, and $20 at the end of every month. You don't like it, you can leave any time, but I won't pay for your ticket out, and I won't give references to people who quit." "What about time off?" "1 Sunday a month, if the work's done. And if I'm injured, sick, I'm not going to throw you out for catching a cold." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "But if you're looking for easy, this isn't it." Clara thought about the laundry house in Denver. 10-hour days in steam and lye, ruining her hands for pennies. Thought about the boarding house where she'd lived, sharing a room with 3 other women, listening to them snore and cry and pray for better lives. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. Ethan stood, putting his hat back on. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over, Mrs. Chen's place. Clean, cheap. Tell her I sent you, she'll give you a fair rate." He dropped $1 on the table. "For tonight." Then he was gone, leaving Clara alone with her terrible coffee and the strangest job offer she'd ever received. The boarding house was better than Clara expected. A narrow building squeezed between a feed store and a closed-up barber shop, but the room was clean and the bed didn't sag too badly. Mrs. Chen, a tiny woman with sharp eyes and silver-streaked hair, took Clara's money and asked no questions, which was worth more than the $1 Ethan had provided. Clara didn't sleep well. The bed was unfamiliar, and her mind wouldn't stop circling back to the platform, to Fortner's dismissive no, to the whispers that had followed her like flies. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, exhaustion won. She slept hard and dreamless until Mrs. Chen knocked on her door at 5:30. "Mr. Hale is here," she said through the wood. "Says you have 10 minutes. Clara dressed quickly, splashed water on her face, and repacked her bag. Everything she owned fit in that one carpet bag. 3 dresses, 2 sets of undergarments, a nightgown, a hairbrush, a small sewing kit, and the book her mother had given her before she died. A collection of Emily Dickinson poems that Clara had read so many times the pages were falling out. Ethan waited outside with a wagon and 2 horses that looked as tired as Clara felt. He didn't greet her, just took her bag and tossed it into the back with the supplies he'd loaded the day before. Can you drive a team? He asked. Yes. Good. You'll take turns with me. It's a long ride. They left Ridgeback as the sun broke over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful if Clara had been in the mood to appreciate it. The town fell away behind them, replaced by open country, rolling plains broken by rocky outcrops and distant mountains that looked like teeth against the sky. Ethan drove in silence for the first hour. Clara sat beside him, watching the landscape roll past, trying not to think about what she'd gotten herself into. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. "Tell me about your ranch," she said. Ethan didn't look at her. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. How many acres? What kind of livestock? How many hands do you employ?" 400 acres, cattle, mostly, and some horses. And I don't employ any hands. Can't afford them. Clara processed this. "So it's just you?" "Just me." "How do you manage 400 acres alone?" "Badly." Ethan's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I keep the core herd going, maintain what I can, and let the rest fall apart. It's not sustainable, but it's what I've got." "What happened to your help?" "Left after Sarah died." His voice flattened on the name. "Can't blame them. I wasn't fit company, and the pay was irregular. Most of them found better situations." "Sarah was your wife?" "Yes." The single word carried enough weight that Clara didn't push further. She'd known grief, had lost her own parents young, watched friends die from disease and childbirth and simple bad luck. She recognized the shape of it in Ethan's voice. They drove on. The sun climbed higher. Around midday, Ethan pulled the wagon off the trail near a creek and unhitched the horses to let them drink and graze. "There's bread and cheese in the pack," he said, nodding toward the supplies. "Help yourself." Clara found the food, simple fare, but fresh enough, and divided it between them. They ate sitting on opposite ends of the wagon, watching the horses. "Why did you offer me work?" Clara asked finally. "There must have been easier choices." Ethan chewed slowly, considering. "I watched you on that platform. Watched you take a beating and not break. That's rare. Most people break. You don't know me. Maybe I break all the time." "Maybe." He finished his bread and brushed crumbs off his hands. "But I don't think so. And I need someone who won't break. The ranch will test you. Weather, isolation, work that never ends. If you were going to shatter, you'd have done it yesterday." "I wanted to." "But you didn't." Clara looked down at her own hands, rough and red, even in the cool autumn air. "Is that enough? Not breaking?" "It's a start." Ethan stood, reaching for the horses. "We should keep moving. Want to make it home before dark." The word home sat strangely in Clara's chest. She'd lived in a lot of places, boarding houses, tenement rooms, the servant quarters of houses where she'd worked, but she hadn't had a home in years, maybe ever. She helped Ethan hitch the horses back up, and they continued north. The land grew rougher as they climbed into hill country. The trail, barely worthy of the name, wound through stands of pine and aspen, the trees already turning gold with the coming winter. Clara saw deer in the distance, and once, an eagle circling high overhead. "It's beautiful," she said, surprising herself. Ethan glanced at her. "Wait until February. See if you still think so." "I've lived through winters before." "Not out here, you haven't." There was no malice in the words, just flat certainty. Clara decided not to argue. She'd prove herself through work, not words. They reached the ranch just as the sun touched the western horizon. Clara's first thought was, "This place is dying." The ranch house stood at the base of a low hill, a two-story structure of logs and stone that had probably been impressive once. Now the porch sagged, several windows were shuttered with planks, and the whole thing had the air of something slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness around it. Outbuildings clustered nearby, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a chicken coop with half its fence missing, a smokehouse with a hole in its roof. Beyond them stretched pastures bordered by split-rail fences in various states of collapse. "I know," Ethan said quietly. "It's worse than I made it sound." "Yes," Clara agreed. "It is." He looked at her sharply. "But I've seen worse," she continued, climbing down from the wagon. "In Denver, I worked in a tenement that should have been condemned. Rats in the walls, roof that leaked in 3 places, stairs so rotted you had to know which ones would hold you. This?" She gestured at the ranch. This is fixable. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, not hope, exactly, but maybe the distant memory of it. Come on, he said. I'll show you the house. The interior was better than the exterior, but only just. Someone, Sarah, Clara guessed, had made an effort once. There were curtains on the windows, now faded and dusty, a handmade rug in the front room, worn thin in the center, furniture that had been quality once but was now scratched and sagging, and dust. Dust everywhere, thick enough to write your name in. Kitchen's through there, Ethan pointed. Pump works, but you have to prime it sometimes. Stove's functional. There's a root cellar out back. Should still have some stores from last season. He led her upstairs where 4 doors opened off a narrow hallway. He opened the first one, revealing a small room with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the pastures. This is yours, he said. I'm at the end of the hall if you need anything. Don't go in the room across from yours. It's locked. Clara didn't ask why. Every house had its locked rooms. I'll bring your bag up, Ethan continued. Then I need to tend the stock. You should rest. We'll start early tomorrow. He left her there, alone in a stranger's house in the middle of nowhere. Clara sat on the bed, which, miraculously, didn't collapse, and looked around her new room. It was clean, at least. Someone had dusted recently, made the bed with fresh sheets. The same someone who'd offered her this job, probably. A hard man trying to keep a dying place alive through sheer stubborn will. She understood that. She'd been doing the same thing for years, just with her own life instead of a ranch. Through the window, she could see Ethan walking toward the barn, his shoulders set against the weight of everything he carried. Behind him, the sun sank lower, setting the sky on fire. Clara stood and unpacked her bag. It didn't take long, she didn't have much, and the dresser had plenty of empty space. When she finished, she went downstairs and found the kitchen. It was a mess. Dishes piled in the basin, the stove cold and dirty, the table covered in the accumulated debris of someone eating alone and not caring about it. But the bones were good, solid counters, a large stove, plenty of storage. Clara rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She found soap and rags under the basin, pumped water until her arms ached, heated it on the stove once she got it lit, washed every dish, every pot, every utensil she could find, scrubbed the table and counters, swept the floor. By the time Ethan returned, the kitchen gleamed in the lamplight. He stopped in the doorway, staring. "You didn't have to do that tonight," he said finally. "I know." Clara wrung out her rag and hung it to dry. "But I don't sleep well in dirty houses, and I was hungry. Figured I'd cook something, but I couldn't cook in that mess." "What did you make?" "Nothing yet. I need to see what's in the cellar first." She turned to face him. "But I will. And tomorrow I'll start on the rest of the house. Day after that, we'll see about those fences. And after that, whatever else needs doing." Ethan leaned against the door frame, and for the first time since she'd met him, something like a smile touched his face. "You really think you can fix this place?" "I think we can try." Clara met his eyes steadily. "That's all anyone can do. Try." He nodded slowly. "Root cellars through that door. There's potatoes, onions, some preserved meat. Whatever you can make from that." She found everything he'd mentioned, plus carrots and dried beans, and even some flour that was still good. Within an hour, she had a simple stew simmering on the stove and biscuits baking in the oven. They ate at the clean table in the clean kitchen and didn't talk much. But the silence felt different than it had in the wagon, less empty, more companionable. After dinner, Clara washed the dishes while Ethan disappeared to do whatever evening chores needed doing. When he came back, she was standing at the window looking out at the darkness that had swallowed the landscape. "It's quiet," she said. "Too quiet?" "No." She turned to face him. "Just different. In the city, there's always noise, people, traffic, factories. Here, it's just silence." "You'll get used to it." Ethan moved toward the stairs. "I'll see you in the morning, 5 o'clock. 5 o'clock, Clara confirmed. She stood alone in the kitchen for a while longer, listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere above, she heard Ethan's footsteps, then a door closing. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Clara thought about the train platform, about Fortner's dismissive no, about the whispers and stares. She thought about the $7.30 still sewn into her bag lining, enough to leave if she wanted, enough to run. But she'd spent her whole life running from one bad situation to the next, always hoping the next place would be better and always being disappointed. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to plant her feet and fight for something, even if that something was a dying ranch in the middle of nowhere, even if everyone thought she was crazy for trying. Clara blew out the lamp and climbed the stairs to her room. Through the thin walls, she could hear Ethan moving around, preparing for bed. The floorboards creaked, a drawer opened and closed. Human sounds, proof she wasn't completely alone. She changed into her nightgown and crawled under the covers. The bed was comfortable, the room was clean, and tomorrow she would wake up and start building something. Maybe it would work. Maybe it wouldn't. But at least she'd be building it on her own terms. For the first time in 3 weeks, Clara slept deeply and woke to the sound of someone knocking on her door. 5 o'clock, Ethan called. Daylight's burning. Clara smiled into her pillow. Then she got up and went to work. The first week nearly killed her. Not literally, though Clara's body screamed otherwise every night when she collapsed into bed. Her hands blistered, then bled, then calloused over. Her back ached from hauling water, scrubbing floors, and wrestling with a cast-iron stove that seemed determined to spite her. She thought she knew hard work. She'd been wrong. On the third morning, she found Ethan in the barn before dawn, trying to shore up a collapsing stall with lumber that looked older than he was. "This won't hold," she said, watching him hammer a board that split the moment the nail went through. "It'll hold long enough." He didn't look up. Long enough for what? The whole thing to come down on the horses? That got his attention. He straightened, hammer still in hand, and fixed her with a look that could have frozen water. "You got a better idea?" "Yes. Stop patching and start rebuilding. This whole section needs to come down and go up again properly." Ethan's jaw worked. "That takes time I don't have and lumber I can't afford." "Then we salvage what we can from the other outbuildings. That chicken coop is half collapsed anyway, and the smokehouse needs a complete roof replacement. We take what's usable, combine it with what you've got stored, and we do it right." "We?" His eyebrow raised. "You know how to frame a wall?" "No. But I can learn. And I can hold boards steady while you hammer. I can haul lumber. I can do whatever needs doing that doesn't require years of experience." Ethan studied her for a long moment. Then he set down his hammer. "You're supposed to be keeping house. The house is clean, cleaner than it's been in years, I'd guess. The kitchen works, the floors don't have an inch of dust on them, and I've already mended every piece of fabric I could find that needed mending. What else am I supposed to do while you're out here working yourself to death?" Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of respect. Most women wouldn't want to do barn work. Most women weren't raised by a father who died when they were 14 and left them to figure out how to keep a roof over their heads. Clara crossed her arms. "I'm here. I'm strong enough. Use me properly, or stop complaining about not having help." A silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of horses shifting in their stalls and the wind whistling through the gaps in the barn walls. Then Ethan nodded once, sharp. "All right, we start after breakfast. But if you can't keep up, I'm not slowing down for you." "I wouldn't expect you to." They worked through that day and into the next, and Clara learned exactly how little she knew about ranch work. Ethan didn't coddle her. He showed her once how to do something, then expected her to do it. When she made mistakes, and she made plenty, he corrected her without comment and moved on. By the end of the first week, they'd torn down the worst section of the barn and started rebuilding. It was slow, back-breaking work, and Clara fell into bed each night so exhausted she barely remembered closing her eyes. But the barn was standing straighter, and something else was happening too, something Clara couldn't quite name. Every morning she woke to find coffee already made in the kitchen. Every evening, when she finished cooking dinner, Ethan had already fed the horses and locked up the chickens. They moved around each other like dancers learning a new routine, awkward at first, then gradually smoother. They didn't talk much. Ethan wasn't the talking type, but sometimes over dinner he'd mention something about the ranch, how the north pasture flooded every spring, how the well needed a new rope, how the fence line along the eastern border had been compromised by fallen trees. And Clara would listen and file it all away, making mental lists of what needed fixing and in what order. On Sunday, her first day off, she walked the property alone while Ethan rode out to check on the cattle herd in the far pastures. The ranch was bigger than she'd realized, sprawling across hills and valleys that seemed to go on forever. Most of it was in disrepair. Fences down, pastures overgrown, a line shack so decrepit it was barely standing. But underneath the neglect, Clara could see the bones of something good. Rich grazing land, water sources, timber for building. The ranch had been something once. Could be something again. When Ethan returned that evening, she had a list waiting. What's this? He frowned at the paper she'd set on the kitchen table. Priorities. Things that need doing before winter, organized by urgency. Clara poured coffee for both of them. The roof needs patching in 3 places. The root cellar door doesn't seal properly. We'll lose half the stores to rot if we don't fix it. And we need to bring in more firewood. What you've got won't last past January. Ethan scanned the list, his expression unreadable. You walked the whole property? Most of it. And you think you know what needs doing? The question should have felt like a challenge. Somehow, it didn't. I think I know what will kill us come winter if we ignore it. The rest can wait. He set down the list and picked up his coffee. The north fence line isn't on here. Because cattle can't break through in winter anyway. Snow's too deep. We fix that in spring when it matters. And the barn door that sticks? Needs doing, but it's not urgent. We can still get it open, just takes effort. I'd rather spend time on things that are actively failing. Ethan drank his coffee slowly. Then he pulled out a pencil and added 2 items to her list. Chimney needs cleaning, and there's a weak spot in the bridge over the creek. If that goes out, we're trapped here until spring thaw. Clara looked at the additions and nodded. I'll start on the chimney tomorrow. That's dangerous work if you don't know what you're doing. Then you'll teach me, like everything else. That almost smile crossed his face again, there and gone in a heartbeat. You don't quit, do you? Not usually. Clara refilled their cups. Quitting's never gotten me anywhere good. They worked through September and into October, racing against the weather. The days grew shorter and colder. Clara learned to read the sky the way Ethan did, spotting the difference between clouds that meant rain and clouds that meant snow. She learned which tools were kept where, which horses could be trusted and which needed watching, how to tell when the stove was hot enough for bread and when it would burn. And slowly, grudgingly, the ranch began to respond. The roof stopped leaking. The root cellar door sealed tight. Firewood stacked high against the north wall of the house, covered with canvas to keep it dry. The barn stood straight and solid, ready for winter. Clara's hands stopped bleeding. Her muscles stopped screaming. She grew lean and hard, her skin weathered by wind and sun. But just as things began to stabilize, the town came calling. Clara was in the kitchen, elbow deep in bread dough, when she heard the wagon. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the window. A small buggy was making its way up the track toward the house, pulled by a neat bay horse. 2 women sat in it, both dressed in clean traveling clothes that marked them as townspeople. Clara's stomach tightened. She'd been at the ranch for 6 weeks and hadn't seen another soul besides Ethan. She told herself that was fine, that she didn't need people, didn't want their judgment or their questions. But now people were here, and there was nowhere to hide. She met them on the porch. Ethan was somewhere in the far pastures and wouldn't be back until evening. She was on her own. "Good morning," said the first woman, a handsome blonde of maybe 40 with sharp eyes and a sharper smile. "You must be Clara Whitmore. I'm Margaret Crane. This is Ruth Donnelly." Ruth, younger and plainer, nodded but didn't speak. "Mrs. Crane?" Clara didn't ask how they knew her name. Small towns talked. "What can I do for you?" "We're from the Ridgeback Ladies' Church Guild. We like to welcome new residents." Margaret's eyes traveled over Clara's worn work dress, her flour-dusted apron, the calloused hands she couldn't quite hide. "Though I admit we expected to call on you in town, not all the way out here." "I work for Mr. Hale," Clara said evenly. "I live here." "So we heard." Margaret's smile didn't waver. "Quite the arrangement, a single woman, living alone with a single man. People are talking, you understand." There it was, the real reason for the visit. "Let them talk," Clara said. "I've got work to do, and I imagine you do too." Ruth's eyes widened slightly. Margaret's smile thinned. "We're not here to judge," Margaret said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "We're here to extend an invitation. There's a church social next Saturday. Everyone attends. It's a chance to meet your neighbors, become part of the community. I appreciate the invitation, but I'll be working." "Surely Mr. Hale can spare you for one afternoon." "That's between me and Mr. Hale." Margaret's expression hardened. "Miss Whitmore, I understand you may not be familiar with how things work in places like Ridgeback, but a woman in your position, unmarried, living in close quarters with a man, needs to be above reproach. Attending church socials, being seen in town, showing the community you're a decent, respectable person. These things matter. Clara felt heat rise in her chest. My position? You mean the position where I work 16-hour days, keeping a ranch from falling apart? Where I earn my keep honestly and don't owe anyone anything? I mean the position where you're living in sin. I'm living in a ranch house with a separate bedroom and a locked door. Mr. Hale is my employer. Nothing more. That's not how it looks. Then people need to get their minds out of the gutter. Claire's voice sharpened. I'm not interested in your church social, Mrs. Crane. I'm not interested in proving myself to people who've already decided what I am. And I'm certainly not interested in standing here being lectured about respectability by someone who drove 12 miles just to gossip. Margaret's face flushed red. How dare you? Good day, Mrs. Crane, Mrs. Donnelly. Clara turned and walked back into the house, closing the door firmly behind her. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the door and took a deep breath. Then another. Outside, she heard the buggy creak as the women climbed back in, heard Margaret's voice, sharp and angry, though she couldn't make out the words. Then the sound of hooves and wheels retreating down the track. Clara returned to her bread dough, but her hands were unsteady and she had to start over twice. When Ethan came home that evening, she told him about the visit. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Margaret Crane is poison, he said finally. Her husband owns the general store. She's got nothing to do all day except mind other people's business. She said people are talking. People are always talking, especially about me. Ethan pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. After Sarah died, they talked about how I'd let her work herself to death. Before that, they talked about how I'd married above my station. There's always something. Should I have gone to the social? Do you want to? Clara thought about it honestly. No. Then don't. Ethan moved toward the stairs. You work for me. What the town thinks isn't part of your job. But it wasn't that simple, and both of them knew it. Over the next 2 weeks, Clara noticed changes. When she went to town for supplies, something she'd started doing once a week, taking the wagon while Ethan worked the ranch, people stared. Conversation stopped when she entered the general store. The clerk who'd been friendly enough the first few times now barely spoke to her. And then there was the woman at the post office. Clara had gone to mail a letter to an old friend in Denver, one of the few people from her previous life she still kept contact with. The postmistress, a severe woman named Mrs. Henderson, took the letter and the coin Clara offered, then looked her up and down with obvious distaste. You're the one staying at the Hale place, she said. Not a question. I work there, yes. Mrs. Henderson marked the letter with more force than necessary. Ethan Hale is a good man, suffered a terrible tragedy with his wife, doesn't need some opportunist taking advantage. Clara's jaw tightened. I'm his employee. Nothing more. That's not what I hear. Then you're hearing wrong. Mrs. Henderson's eyes glittered. Am I? An unmarried woman living under his roof, cooking his meals, washing his clothes? What exactly do you think that looks like? It looks like a job. Clara snatched up her change. And if people want to make it into something else, that says more about them than it does about me. She left before the woman could respond, but the encounter rattled her. She finished her errands quickly and drove the wagon home in record time, grateful for the isolation of the ranch. That night over dinner, Ethan noticed her silence. Something happened in town? He asked. Clara considered lying, then decided he deserved the truth. The postmistress thinks I'm your mistress. Ethan's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Martha Henderson said that? Not in those words, but the meaning was clear. He set down his fork carefully. I'll talk to her. Don't. Clara shook her head. It'll just make it worse. Give them more to talk about. So what? We just let them spread lies? They're not lies to them. They see what they want to see. Clara pushed food around her plate. I knew this would happen, a woman alone, working for a single man. It always comes with assumptions. You shouldn't have to deal with that. But I do. We both do. Clara met his eyes. The question is whether we let it matter. Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. a decision being made. No, we don't let it matter. You do your job. I do mine. The rest of them can go to hell. Clara felt something loosen in her chest. All right then. They finished dinner in companionable silence, but Clara could feel the weight of the town's judgment settling over the ranch like a blanket of snow. It got worse before it got better. The next time Clara went to town, the general store clerk refused to extend credit, something he'd done without question for Ethan for years. New policy, he said, not meeting her eyes. Cash only. Clara had the cash, barely, but it meant stretching supplies thinner than planned. She bought what she absolutely needed and left, feeling the stares following her out. 2 days later, she found a note nailed to the ranch gate. The handwriting was crude, the message cruder, whore. Clara tore it down before Ethan could see it, but her hands shook as she fed it to the stove. She tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that she'd faced worse in her life. But the casual cruelty of it, the assumption that she was something shameful, something dirty, it burrowed under her skin and stayed there. The weather turned colder. November arrived with the first real snow, and Clara threw herself into work with renewed intensity. If she was exhausted enough, she didn't have time to think about the town, didn't have time to care what they thought. She and Ethan fell into new rhythms. He taught her to shoot, taking her out to the far pasture with an old rifle and setting up targets. Clara had never held a gun before, but she was a quick study. By the end of the week, she could hit a tin can at 30 yards. Why am I learning this? She asked, reloading for another round. Because winter brings wolves, and sometimes worse. Ethan adjusted her stance. You're out here alone when I'm checking the herds. You need to be able to protect yourself. The thought of wolves hadn't occurred to her. The thought of what he meant by worse made her stomach tight. Has anyone ever tried to... She didn't finish the sentence. No. But Sarah always knew how to shoot. Made me feel better when I was gone. His voice went distant on his wife's name. Just seems right that you should know too. Clara nodded and aimed at the next target. The rifle kicked against her shoulder and the can flew off the fence post. Good, Ethan said. Again. They practiced until her shoulder ached and her ears rang. Then they walked back to the house in the gathering dusk, rifles over their shoulders, looking for all the world like partners instead of employer and employee. That night, Clara found herself thinking about Sarah. Ethan never talked about her, never mentioned her except in passing. But her presence lingered in the house, in the faded curtains, in the worn rug, in the locked room across from Clara's that was never opened. Clara wondered what Sarah had been like, whether she'd faced the same judgment from town, whether she'd been strong enough to ignore it, or whether it had worn her down the way it was starting to wear Clara down. The next Sunday, Clara made a decision. I'm going to the church social, she told Ethan over breakfast. He looked up from his coffee, surprised. I thought you didn't want to go. I don't, but hiding here isn't working. They're already convinced I'm something I'm not. Maybe if they see me, talk to me, they'll realize they're wrong. Ethan's expression suggested he doubted that very much. You don't owe them anything. I know, but I'm tired of being called a whore by people who've never spoken to me. His jaw tightened. Someone called you that? Someone wrote it on a note and nailed it to our gate. Clara hadn't meant to tell him, but the words came out anyway. 3 weeks ago. I threw it away. Ethan's chair scraped back violently as he stood. Why didn't you tell me? Because what would you have done? Gone to town and demanded to know who wrote it? That would have just confirmed everything they think. I would have... He stopped, breathing hard. They had no right. They think they have every right, that's the problem. Clara stood too, moving to clear the dishes. So I'm going to the social. I'm going to be polite and pleasant and show them I'm not what they think. And maybe, just maybe, they'll leave us alone. Ethan looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he grabbed his hat. I'll take you. You don't have to. I'm taking you. If they're going to talk, they can talk about both of us. The social was held in the church hall, a long wooden building at the edge of town. By the time Clara and Ethan arrived, Clara in her best dress, hair pinned neatly, looking as respectable as she could manage, the hall was already crowded. Conversation stuttered when they walked in. Clara felt every eye turn toward them, felt the weight of judgment, curiosity, and barely concealed hostility. But she lifted her chin and walked in like she had every right to be there. Margaret Crane materialized almost immediately, her smile bright and false. Miss Whitmore? Mr. Hale, how wonderful that you could join us. Mrs. Crane, Clara kept her voice level. Thank you for the invitation. Of course, though I'm surprised to see you both arrive together. People might... Margaret trailed off meaningfully. People might what? Ethan's voice was flat. Think I gave my employee a ride to town? Seems reasonable to me. Margaret's smile tightened. Of course. Well, Clara, let me introduce you around. There are several ladies here who've been very curious about you. She led Clara away from Ethan, deeper into the crowd. The women she introduced were uniformly polite and uniformly cold. They asked questions that sounded innocent but weren't. How long did she plan to stay? Did she have family elsewhere? What were her intentions regarding Mr. Hale? Clara answered each one carefully, revealing nothing, claiming nothing. Just a woman doing a job, saving money, planning for a future that was her own business. But she could feel their disbelief, could see it in the way they glanced at each other, in the slight smirks they tried to hide. She was in the middle of a particularly stilted conversation about the weather when she heard a new voice, clear and carrying across the room. Well, I think it's shameful. Clara turned. A young woman stood near the refreshment table, beautiful in the way that drew attention. Blonde curls, blue eyes, a figure that the simple dress couldn't quite hide. She was talking to a group of other women, but her voice was pitched loud enough for half the room to hear. A woman living alone with a man, no chaperone, no propriety, and everyone's just pretending it's acceptable? The young woman shook her head. Poor Sarah Hale must be turning in her grave. Clara felt ice slide down her spine. Around her, the women she'd been talking to suddenly found their drinks fascinating. Excuse me, Clara said quietly. She walked toward the refreshment table, aware of Ethan's eyes on her from across the room but ignoring the warning in them. The blonde woman watched her approach with something like satisfaction. You must be talking about me, Clara said when she reached them. I'm Clara Whitmore. The woman's smile was pure poison. I know who you are. I'm Lydia Carson. My family owns half the land around Ridgeback. How nice for you. Clara kept her tone even. I couldn't help but overhear your concerns about my living arrangements. Perhaps I can clarify a few things. Oh, I think the situation is quite clear. Lydia's voice dripped false sympathy. You're a woman with no prospects who latched onto a vulnerable widower. It's sad, really. Several women nearby gasped. Clara felt anger ignite in her chest, hot and sharp. You're right, she said. I am a woman with no prospects. I'm too old, too plain, and too poor to catch a husband the conventional way. So instead, I chose to work. I chose to earn my keep honestly, doing backbreaking labor for fair pay. If that's shameful to you, then I'm afraid we have very different definitions of the word. Lydia's eyes narrowed. You're living in sin. I'm living in a ranch house with a locked bedroom door. Mr. Hale is my employer. We work together to keep his ranch from failing. That's all. That's not what it looks like. Then you need to look harder. Clara stepped closer, close enough that Lydia couldn't pretend this was a public conversation anymore. Or maybe you need to ask yourself why you're so interested in what happens at the Hale Ranch. Seems like a lot of energy to spend on someone else's business. Lydia's face flushed red. How dare you? Ladies. Margaret Crane appeared between them, her smile strained. Perhaps we should all calm down. This is a church social, after all. Of course. Clara stepped back. Forgive me. I wouldn't want to disrupt your lovely event. She turned and walked toward the door, ignoring the whispers that erupted in her wake. Ethan intercepted her halfway across the room. We're leaving, she said before he could speak. He didn't argue, just took her arm and guided her out into the cold November air. They didn't talk on the ride home. Clara stared at the darkening landscape and felt something break inside her chest. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet cracking, like ice giving way. She'd tried. She'd gone to their social, been polite, explained herself, and it hadn't mattered. They'd already decided who she was, and nothing she said would change their minds. When they reached the ranch, Ethan helped her down from the wagon without a word. Clara went straight to the house, climbed the stairs to her room, and closed the door. She didn't cry. She was too angry for tears. Instead, she lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling and made a decision. She was done trying to prove herself to people who didn't want to see the truth, done caring what the town thought, done shrinking herself to fit into their narrow definitions of acceptable. If they wanted to call her a whore, let them. She'd survived their judgment the same way she'd survived everything else, by working hard, keeping her head up, and refusing to break. And if that meant she spent the rest of her life isolated on this ranch, so be it. At least here, she was building something that mattered. Winter came down hard that year. The first real storm hit 3 days after the church social, dumping 2 feet of snow across the ranch in a single night. Clara woke to a world transformed, white and silent and bitterly cold. The thermometer outside the kitchen window read 8 degrees. She built up the fire in the stove and started coffee, moving quietly so as not to wake Ethan. But when she turned around, he was already there, dressed and pulling on his heavy coat. "Storm hit harder than I expected," he said, taking the coffee she offered. "I need to check on the cattle. Some of them were in the north pasture yesterday. If they didn't make it to shelter, we could lose half the herd." "I'll come with you." "No, too dangerous if you don't know the land. I'll be back by afternoon." Clara wanted to argue, but she could see the set of his jaw. This wasn't negotiable. "Be careful." He nodded and was gone, disappearing into the white landscape like a ghost. Clara spent the morning doing what she could, keeping the fires going, melting snow for water since the pump had frozen, checking on the horses in the barn. The chickens huddled in their coop, refusing to come out even for feed. She couldn't blame them. By noon, the temperature had dropped further. By 2 o'clock, Clara stood at the kitchen window watching the tree line, waiting for Ethan to appear. He didn't. 3 o'clock came and went, then 4. Clara pulled on every piece of warm clothing she owned and grabbed the rifle. She knew it was stupid. She didn't know the land well enough to track him, and she'd probably get lost herself. But the alternative was standing here doing nothing while he froze to death somewhere out there. She made it maybe a quarter mile from the house before she saw him. He was on foot, leading his horse, moving slowly through snow that came up to his knees. Even from a distance, Clara could see he was limping. She ran to meet him, or tried to. Running in 2 feet of snow was more like violent wading. "What happened?" she called when she got close enough. "Horse went down in a drift, twisted my ankle getting clear." Ethan's face was gray with pain and cold. "Cattle are fine. Got them moved to the lower pasture." "Can you walk?" "Been walking for an hour. Can keep walking." But he couldn't, not really. Clara got under his arm, taking as much of his weight as she could manage, and together they struggled back to the house. By the time they reached the porch, both of them were shaking with cold and exhaustion. Inside, Clara stripped off her outer layers and then turned to Ethan. His lips were blue, his hands clumsy as he tried to unbutton his coat. "Sit," she ordered, pushing him toward a chair. "Let me." She got him out of his wet clothes with brisk efficiency, trying not to notice the scars on his chest and arms, old injuries from a life lived hard. She wrapped him in blankets and put his feet in a basin of lukewarm water, warming them slowly so the tissue wouldn't damage. Then she looked at his ankle. It was already swelling, the skin purple and angry. "This needs wrapping," she said, "and you're not walking on it for at least a week. Can't afford not to walk. Ranch doesn't stop because I'm injured. The ranch will survive. You won't if you make this worse." Clara stood. "I'll handle the daily work. You stay off that foot and let it heal." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Maybe he saw something in her expression that told him it would be pointless. "All right," he said finally, "but only for a few days." It ended up being closer to 2 weeks. Clara learned fast. She had to. The cattle needed checking twice a day. The horses needed feeding and watering. The chickens needed their coop cleaned and fresh straw laid down. And all of it had to happen in bone-deep cold that made her hands numb, even through thick gloves. Ethan tried to help from the house, but Clara wouldn't let him. He sat at the kitchen table with his foot propped up, looking progressively more frustrated as she came and went, handling tasks he'd been doing alone for years. "You're doing it wrong," he said on the 4th day when she came in from feeding the horses. "The horses are fed. How can that be wrong?" "You're giving them too much hay. We need to stretch supplies." Clara hung up her coat and turned to face him. "The horses are half starved already. I'm giving them what they need to stay healthy through winter. We'll figure out the rest." "There is no rest. What we have is what we have." "Then we'll get more." Clara poured coffee, her hands still trembling from the cold. "There are other ranches around here. Someone has extra feed they'd sell." "Not to me, they won't." The bitterness in his voice made her pause. Why not? Ethan stared into his coffee. Because I haven't exactly made friends. After Sarah died, I wasn't pleasant to be around. Told more than one neighbor to leave me alone and not come back. They listened. All of them? Most. The rest gave up after a while. Clara sat down across from him. So you've been doing this completely alone for 3 years. Didn't need anyone. Everyone needs someone. She kept her voice gentle. Even stubborn ranchers who'd rather freeze to death than ask for help. Ethan's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. You sound like Sarah. She was always after me to be more sociable. It was the first time he'd volunteered anything about his wife. Clara tread carefully. What was she like? Strong, smarter than me by a long shot, could outwork most men I knew. Ethan's eyes went distant. Met her in town. She was a school teacher. Everyone said she was too good for me. They were probably right. How long were you married? 8 years. Best 8 years of my life. His jaw tightened. Then the fever came through. Took out half the town. Sarah insisted on helping nurse the sick. I told her to stay home, but she wouldn't listen. Said people needed help, and she wasn't going to hide while her neighbors died. Clara could see where the story was going. She got sick. 3 weeks after the outbreak started. Went fast after that. 5 days from first symptom to... He stopped, swallowed hard. I couldn't save her. Couldn't do anything except watch her die. I'm sorry, Clara said quietly. Yeah. Me too. Ethan stood abruptly, forgetting his ankle. He hissed in pain and grabbed the table for balance. Clara was on her feet instantly, steadying him. You need to rest. I'm tired of resting. Tired of sitting here useless while you do my job. It's my job too now, and I'm managing fine. You shouldn't have to manage alone. Neither should you. Clara held his gaze. That's the whole point of me being here, isn't it? So you don't have to do everything by yourself anymore? Something shifted in Ethan's expression. Surprise, maybe, or the beginning of understanding that he wasn't alone anymore, whether he wanted to be or not. Get back to bed, Clara said, softer now. Let me handle things for a few more days, please. He went without further argument, and Clara returned to her work. The days blurred together in a haze of cold and exhaustion. Clara developed a routine, up before dawn to start fires and make breakfast, out to feed livestock and break ice on water troughs, back in to cook and clean and mend, out again in the afternoon for another round of checks, then inside for dinner and whatever repairs needed doing before bed. She fell asleep the moment her head hit the pillow and woke what felt like minutes later to start all over again. But the ranch held together. The animals stayed healthy, and Ethan's ankle slowly healed. By the time he was walking again, limping, but walking, Clara had proven something to both of them. She could run this place. Not easily, not without cost, but she could do it. The realization changed things between them in ways neither of them acknowledged out loud. They moved around each other with new awareness, a partnership forming where before there had been just employer and employee. And then Lydia Carson showed up. It was a Wednesday afternoon, unseasonably warm for late December. Clara was in the barn, mucking out stalls, when she heard hoofbeats. She looked up to see a fine black horse trotting into the yard, and on it, dressed in a riding habit that probably cost more than Clara made in 6 months, was Lydia. Clara wiped her hands on her work pants and stepped out of the barn, squinting into the bright winter sun. Miss Carson, she said, keeping her voice neutral, didn't expect to see you out here. Lydia dismounted gracefully and tied her horse to the rail. I came to see Ethan. Is he here? In the house. But he's recovering from an injury. Not really up for visitors. I'm not a visitor. I'm a friend. Lydia's smile was sharp. We go back years. I'm sure he'll want to see me. Clara doubted that, but didn't say so. I'll let him know you're here. She walked to the house, Lydia following close behind. Inside, Ethan was at the table, going over accounts. He looked up when they entered, and his expression went carefully blank. Lydia. Ethan. She swept past Clara like she didn't exist and moved to the table. I heard you'd been injured. I was worried. Just a twisted ankle, nothing serious. Ethan's tone was polite, but cold. What brings you all the way out here? Can't a friend check on a friend? Lydia pulled off her gloves, looking around the kitchen with obvious appraisal. Though I see you've been well cared for. Miss Whitmore seems to be settling in. Clara felt the barb but didn't react. She moved to the stove, putting coffee on like this was a normal social call. Clara's been managing the ranch while I recovered, Ethan said. Couldn't have done it without her. Lydia's smile tightened. How fortunate, though I'm sure you're eager to get back to normal now that you're healed. This is normal. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Lydia's eyes flickered to Clara, then back to Ethan. I actually came to extend an invitation, she said, her voice brightening artificially. My family is hosting a Christmas dinner. All our friends will be there. I'd love for you to come, Ethan. It's been too long since you've been social. I appreciate the offer, but I'll be staying here. Surely you can spare one evening. Christmas is a time for community, after all. My community is here. Ethan's voice was firm. Clara and I will have our own Christmas. Lydia's composure cracked slightly. You're choosing to spend Christmas with your hired help instead of with people of your own class? Clara's hand stilled on the coffee pot. Ethan stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. Clara isn't just hired help. She's the only reason this ranch is still standing, and she's more honest company than most people I know. So yes, I'm choosing to spend Christmas here, with her. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Lydia recovered quickly, her smile snapping back into place. Of course. How noble of you, though I wonder what Sarah would think about all this. It was a low blow, and everyone in the room knew it. Sarah would have liked Clara, Ethan said quietly. She would have appreciated someone willing to work hard and not quit when things got difficult. Unlike some people. Lydia's face flushed. I should go. Clearly I'm not welcome here. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. She pulled on her gloves with sharp, angry movements. But before I leave, let me give you some advice, Ethan. People are talking. About you, about her, about what's happening out here. You might not care about your reputation, but you should think about hers. A woman living alone with a man, no marriage, no propriety, it doesn't end well for the woman. It never does. Clara finally spoke. I appreciate your concern, Miss Carson, but I'm perfectly capable of handling my own reputation. Are you? Lydia turned to face her fully. Because from where I stand, you're headed for disaster. When Ethan tires of you, and he will, where will you go? Who will hire a woman who's been living in sin? Who will marry you? I'm not looking to get married. I'm looking to work and earn my keep. That's all. How tragically naive. Lydia moved toward the door. Ethan, when you come to your senses, you know where to find me. I'll be waiting. She left in a swirl of expensive fabric and barely contained rage. Clara watched through the window as she mounted her horse and rode off at a pace that suggested she wanted to run something over. Well, Clara said finally, that was unpleasant. Ethan sat back down, looking suddenly exhausted. Lydia's always been like that. Persistent. She wants you. She wants the idea of me, the ranch, the status, the story of saving the tragic widower. His voice was bitter. It's got nothing to do with who I actually am. Clara poured coffee for both of them and sat down. Were you ever involved? No? She made it clear she was interested after Sarah died, but I wasn't. I'm still not. Ethan met her eyes. What she said about people talking, that's true. It's going to get worse. Let it. Clara, I mean it. I don't care what they say. I'm not leaving. Not because of gossip. Not because some spoiled rich girl thinks I'm beneath her. Not because the whole town wants to believe the worst about me. Clara's voice was steady. I'm staying, unless you're asking me to go. I'm not asking you to go. Ethan said it quickly, firmly. I don't want you to go. The words settled between them, meaning more than either was ready to acknowledge. Then we're settled, Clara said. Now drink your coffee before it gets cold. They didn't talk about it again, but something had changed. Some line had been crossed, some statement made that couldn't be taken back. Christmas came quiet and simple. Clara cooked a chicken, one of the older hens that had stopped laying, and made biscuits and gravy and a dried apple pie with the last of their stores. They ate at the kitchen table, just the two of them, and it felt more like home than any Christmas Clara could remember. After dinner, Ethan disappeared upstairs and came back with a small wrapped package. It's not much, he said, handing it to her, but I wanted you to have something. Clara unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a pair of leather gloves, beautifully made, lined with soft wool. The kind of gloves she could never have afforded on her own. "Ethan, this is too much. Your hands are getting torn up from the work. You need proper gloves." He looked almost embarrassed. "I ordered them from the catalog back in November, before everything." Clara slipped them on. They fit perfectly. "Thank you, really." "You're welcome." She went upstairs and came back with her own gift, a shirt she'd made from fabric she'd bought on one of her town trips, sewn late at night when he was already asleep. It wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy and well made, the stitching neat and tight. Ethan held it up, examining her work. "You made this?" "I used to sew for a living before the laundry work. I'm a bit rusty, but it should hold up." "It's perfect." He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made Clara's breath catch. "Thank you." They stood there in the warm kitchen, gifts in hand, and Clara felt the weight of all the unspoken things between them, gratitude and loneliness, and the beginning of something neither of them had names for yet. "Merry Christmas, Ethan," she said softly. "Merry Christmas, Clara." The moment passed, and they cleaned up dinner together, moving around each other with practiced ease. But that night, lying in her bed, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at her. Like she mattered. Like she was more than just hired help. It was dangerous feeling this way. She knew that. Getting attached to this place, to this life, to him, it was asking for heartbreak. Nothing lasted. Everything good eventually fell apart. But maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. January came in brutal and stayed that way. The temperature dropped below zero and stayed there for days. The wind howled across the plains, driving snow through every crack and gap in the buildings. Clara and Ethan worked side by side, battling the cold, keeping the animals alive, keeping the ranch running. And then, one night in mid-January, Clara smelled smoke. She woke from a dead sleep, her mind instantly alert. Something was wrong. She could taste it in the air, acrid and chemical and completely out of place. She grabbed her robe and rushed into the hall. Smoke was seeping up through the floorboards, thin wisps that made her heart slam into her throat. "Ethan!" She pounded on his door. Fire! The house is on fire!" He was out of bed in seconds, dressed only in pants, his eyes wide and alert. "Where?" "Downstairs, I think the kitchen." They ran down together. The kitchen was full of smoke, and flames were licking up one wall, not from the stove but from the outside, as if someone had set it deliberately. "Get water!" Ethan shouted, already grabbing the bucket they kept by the sink. Clara ran to the pump, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the handle. She filled bucket after bucket, passing them to Ethan, who threw them on the flames. The smoke thickened, making her eyes water and her lungs burn. "It's not working," Ethan coughed, backing away from the wall. "The whole side is going up." "What about the barn?" Clara's mind raced. "If it spreads to the barn? Go wake the horses. Get them out to the far pasture. Now!" Clara didn't argue. She ran outside into the freezing night, the cold hitting her like a physical blow after the heat of the kitchen. The barn was still untouched, but smoke was starting to drift from the house. She got the horses out first, then the chickens, throwing them bodily into the yard and hoping they'd have the sense to run. Behind her, she could hear Ethan shouting, could see flames starting to break through the roof. When she turned back to the house, she realized with horror that she couldn't see Ethan anymore. "Ethan!" She screamed his name, running toward the door. Smoke poured out in thick black clouds. The heat was intense, even from 10 feet away. "Ethan, where are you?" No answer. Clara didn't think. She pulled her robe up over her nose and mouth and ran into the burning house. The smoke was blinding. She couldn't see, could barely breathe. She felt her way along the wall, coughing, calling his name. "Clara, get out!" His voice came from somewhere to her right, choked and desperate. She followed the sound and found him in the hallway, trying to drag something heavy. It took her a moment to realize it was a trunk. The trunk from the locked room. "Leave it!" she shouted. "I can't! You'll die!" A beam cracked above them, showering sparks. Clara grabbed his arm and pulled, using all her strength. "Leave it, or we both die." Something in her voice got through to him. He let go of the trunk and let her drag him toward the door. They stumbled outside together just as part of the roof collapsed behind them, sending up a shower of embers into the night sky. They collapsed in the snow 20 feet from the house, gasping and coughing. Clara's lungs felt like they were full of ground glass. Her hands were blistered where she'd touched hot wood, but they were alive. They sat there in the freezing night, watching the house burn. There was nothing they could do now except make sure it didn't spread to the other buildings. The house itself was lost. "What was in the trunk?" Clara asked when she could speak again. Ethan didn't answer for a long time. When he did, his voice was raw. "Sarah's things. Her clothes, her books, her letters. Everything I had left of her. I'm sorry. You should have let me get it. You would have died. Maybe that would have been better." The words were barely audible. Clara turned to look at him. His face was black with soot, his eyes red from smoke. He looked broken in a way she hadn't seen before, not even when talking about his wife's death. "Don't say that," she said fiercely. "Don't you dare say that." "Why not? Look at it." He gestured at the burning house. "Everything's gone. The house, Sarah's things, everything I built. What's the point anymore? The point is, you're alive. We're alive. We can rebuild. With what? I've got nothing left. You've got me." The words came out before Clara could stop them. "You've got me, and I'm not going anywhere." Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara saw something crack in his expression. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you stay? You could leave. Go somewhere easier, somewhere you're not fighting every day just to survive." "Because I don't want easy. I want this. I want—" She stopped, not sure how to finish. "Want what?" Clara met his eyes. "I want to matter. I want to build something that's mine. I want to wake up every morning and know I'm fighting for something worth having. And yes, that includes you. It includes this ranch and this life and everything we've been trying to save. So I'm staying, whether you want me to or not." The fire crackled and roared behind them, but neither of them looked away. Then Ethan reached out and took her hand. His fingers were rough and cold and trembling slightly. "I want you to stay," he said quietly. "I need you to stay." Clara squeezed his hand. "Then I will." They sat there together as the house burned down to embers, holding on to each other in the cold and the dark, and Clara knew that everything had changed between them. No going back now. They spent the rest of that night in the barn, huddled under horse blankets, watching the last of the house collapse into glowing coals. When dawn finally broke, gray and cold, Clara made herself stand up and survey the damage. The house was gone. Just a blackened foundation and twisted metal from the stove remained. Everything else, furniture, supplies, clothes, the kitchen she'd scrubbed clean, the bedroom where she'd slept, reduced to ash. Ethan sat on an overturned bucket, staring at the ruins with hollow eyes. "We need to figure out what happened," Clara said, her voice hoarse from smoke. "That fire didn't start by accident." "What do you mean?" "I mean the flames were on the outside wall, not near the stove, not near any lamp. Someone set that fire, Ethan." He looked at her sharply. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be. The way it spread, the smell, that wasn't cooking grease or a knocked-over lantern. That was deliberate." Ethan stood slowly, his face hardening. Who would do that? Clara thought about Lydia's visit, her thinly veiled threats. Thought about the town's judgment, Margaret Crane's poisoned tongue, the note nailed to the gate. Could be anyone who thinks we're living in sin. Could be someone who wants you to fail. Could be Lydia. Ethan's voice was flat. "She came here, tried to get me to leave you, and when I refused, she threatened your reputation." "That's a big leap from threats to arson." "Is it?" Ethan started walking toward the remains of the house, his boots crunching through frozen snow. "The Carsons own half this territory. They've been trying to buy me out for years, ever since before Sarah died. I kept refusing. Maybe they got tired of waiting." Clara followed him, her mind racing. If that's true, if they're willing to burn down your house, what's to stop them from doing worse? Nothing. Ethan kicked at a piece of charred wood. "Which means we need proof, and we need to be ready for whatever comes next." They spent the morning salvaging what they could, which wasn't much. A few tools from the barn, some canned goods from the root cellar that had miraculously survived, blankets and supplies that had been stored in the outbuildings. Everything else was gone. By midday, Clara's hands were raw and her entire body ached, but she kept working. They needed shelter before nightfall, and the barn was the only option. She and Ethan cleared out 2 of the unused stalls, laid down fresh straw, and rigged up blankets for privacy. It was crude and cold and nothing like a real house, but it would keep them alive. That evening, as they ate beans heated over a fire outside the barn, Ethan finally spoke the words Clara had been dreading. "You should leave." Clara's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. "What?" "Go to town. Take what money I have left, get on a train, go somewhere safe. He gestured at the burned house, the makeshift camp. "This is only going to get worse. If someone's willing to burn down a house, they're willing to hurt people. I won't have you caught in the middle of it." "No." "Clara, I said no." She set down her bowl. "I'm not leaving. We've been over this." "That was before someone tried to kill us." "They didn't try to kill us. They tried to scare us. If they wanted us dead, they would have barred the doors." Clara kept her voice level, even though her heart was pounding. This was a message. They want you to give up, sell out, disappear, and I'll be damned if I let them win. Ethan stared at her. "You could die. I could die crossing the street in Denver. I could have died a dozen times before I ever came here. Death isn't the worst thing that can happen to a person, Ethan. Living scared is worse. Living small is worse." "You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking perfectly clearly. You want to know why I'm staying?" Clara leaned forward. "Because for the first time in my entire life, I'm fighting for something that matters. Not just survival, not just the next meal or the next roof over my head. I'm fighting for this place. For you, for the life we're building, and I'm not walking away from that just because someone lit a fire." The words hung between them, raw and honest. Ethan's expression cracked. "I can't lose you too." "Then don't push me away." He looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused and shaking slightly. "When Sarah died, I swore I wouldn't let myself care about anyone again. It hurt too much. It broke something in me that I didn't think would ever heal. And now? Now I'm terrified." He met her eyes. "Because I do care. About you. About what happens to you. And I don't know how to protect you from whatever's coming." Clara reached across the space between them and took his hand. "You don't have to protect me. We protect each other. That's how this works." Ethan's fingers tightened around hers. Then, slowly, he pulled her closer until their foreheads touched, and they sat there in the cold twilight, holding on to each other like anchors in a storm. "All right," he said finally, "we do this together. But if things get too dangerous, we'll figure it out together," Clara finished. "No more talk of me leaving. We're in this now." "Yeah, we are." They stayed like that until the fire burned down to embers, and then they retreated to their separate stalls in the barn, separated by a thin blanket and 1,000 unspoken feelings. The next morning, they rode into town together. Ridgeback looked the same as always: dusty Main Street, false-fronted buildings, people going about their business. But Clara felt different, harder. She'd lost her fear of these people somewhere between the church social and watching her home burn down. They tied their horses outside the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Tom Brennan, looked up from his desk with obvious surprise when they walked in. "Ethan, Miss Whitmore, what brings you to town?" "Someone burned down my house last night," Ethan said without preamble. "I'm filing a report." Brennan's eyebrows rose. "Burned down? You sure it wasn't an accident?" "I'm sure. Fire started on the outside wall, spread too fast to be natural. Someone set it deliberately." The sheriff pulled out a form and started writing. "Any idea who might have done it?" "Could be anyone who wants me off my land. The Carsons have been trying to buy me out for years." Brennan's hand stilled. "That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime. Someone tried to burn us alive in our beds." "You got proof it was the Carsons specifically?" "Not yet, but I intend to find it." The sheriff set down his pen. "Ethan, I understand you're upset, but you can't go around accusing prominent families without evidence. The Carsons are respected people. They wouldn't..." "Wouldn't what? Wouldn't try to force out a stubborn rancher who won't sell?" Clara cut in. "Wouldn't spread rumors about a woman they don't like? Wouldn't set a fire and then hide behind their reputation?" Brennan looked at her like he'd forgotten she could speak. "Miss Whitmore, I know you're new here, but nothing. Someone committed arson. That's a crime. Your job is to investigate, not make excuses for wealthy families." The sheriff's face reddened. "I don't make excuses, but I also don't pursue investigations based on hunches and bad feelings. You bring me evidence, I'll look into it. Until then, all I can do is file the report. Ethan leaned forward, his voice dangerously quiet. Then file it. And know that if anything else happens, if anyone gets hurt, I'm holding you responsible for not taking this seriously. They left before Brennan could respond, stepping out into the cold morning air. That was pointless, Clara said. Maybe, but now it's on record. If they try again, he can't pretend he didn't know. They walked toward the general store, and Clara noticed the stares following them. Worse than usual, more intense. A woman across the street whispered something to her companion, both of them looking directly at Clara. Inside the store, the clerk, the same one who'd refused them credit before, was openly hostile. "Heard about your house," he said, not looking up from his ledger. "Shame." "Is it?" Ethan's voice was cold. "Because you don't sound particularly sympathetic." "Just saying it's a shame. Things like that happen when people aren't careful." "We were careful. Someone set that fire deliberately." The clerk finally looked up, and there was something calculating in his eyes. "That's quite a claim. You accusing someone?" "Should I be?" "Wouldn't know. But seems to me a man in your position should be more careful about making enemies." Clara felt Ethan tense beside her. She put a hand on his arm, a silent warning. "We need supplies," she said. "Flour, salt, coffee, beans, whatever you can spare. Cash only." "Fine. Cash only." Ethan pulled out his wallet, nearly empty now. "How much?" The clerk named a price that was easily twice what it should have been. "That's robbery," Clara said flatly. "That's the price. Take it or leave it." They took it because they had no choice, and walked out with barely enough supplies to last a week. "He's gouging us," Clara said when they were back outside. "Of course he is. He knows we're desperate, knows we've got nowhere else to go." Ethan loaded their meager purchases into the saddlebags. "The Carsons probably own part of his store too. They own part of everything in this town." "Then we go somewhere else. There must be another town. Nearest town is 40 miles south. We don't have the resources to make that trip regularly, not in winter." Clara felt the trap closing around them. No house, limited supplies, enemies on all sides, and winter that would last another 2 months at least. They were about to mount their horses when Lydia Carson appeared, stepping out of the milliner's shop with a package under her arm. She stopped when she saw them, her expression shifting from surprise to something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Ethan. Clara." She crossed the street toward them. "I heard about the fire. How terrible." "Was it?" Ethan's voice was like ice. "Of course. To lose everything like that. You must be devastated." Her eyes traveled over their smoke-stained clothes, the exhaustion in their faces. "Where are you staying now?" "The barn." "The barn? Oh, that's just awful. You can't possibly survive the winter in a barn." Lydia's concern was so false it was almost funny. "You should really consider my father's offer. He's still willing to buy the ranch, even after everything. He's very generous that way." "I'm not selling." "Ethan, be reasonable. You have no house, no resources. What are you holding on to?" "My land. My life. My choices." He mounted his horse. "And I don't need your father's charity or his land grab disguised as generosity." Lydia's mask slipped. "You're being stubborn and stupid. My father is a powerful man. When he wants something, he gets it, one way or another." "Is that a threat?" Clara asked, mounting her own horse. "It's a fact." Lydia looked between them. "You should both leave. Sell the land, take the money, go somewhere you're wanted, before something worse happens." "Worse than arson?" Ethan's voice was deadly quiet. Lydia smiled. "Accidents happen all the time out here, especially in winter. People freeze to death. Animals stampede, wagons overturn." She adjusted her package. "It would be tragic if something happened to either of you, particularly you, Clara. You're so far from home, no family, no friends. Who would even notice if you disappeared?" Clara's blood ran cold, but she kept her voice steady. "If anything happens to us, everyone will know who to blame." "Will they? Because from where I stand, you're just a desperate woman living in sin with a broken-down rancher. Nobody cares what happens to people like you." Lydia turned to leave, then paused. "My father's offer stands for 1 more week. After that, all bets are off." She walked away, her back straight and her head high, every inch the queen of her small kingdom. "We need to be ready," Ethan said once she was out of earshot. "If they're threatening openly, they're planning something. I know. Clara's hands were shaking on the reins. What do we do? We fight back, but smart. We need allies, people who aren't in the Carsons' pocket. Like who? Everyone in this town either works for them or is too scared to cross them. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then his expression changed. Not everyone. There's a rancher about 15 miles east, Jack Morrison. He and the Carsons have been feuding for years over water rights. If anyone would help us, it's him. Then we go see him. They rode out that afternoon, following trails that climbed into rougher country. The Morrison ranch was smaller than Ethan's, but better maintained with a solid house and well-kept outbuildings. Jack Morrison turned out to be a grizzled man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. He listened to their story without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. "Burned your house down," he said when they finished. "That sounds like Carson, all right. He tried something similar with me 5 years back, poisoned my water source, killed half my cattle. Couldn't prove it was him, but I knew." "Did the sheriff investigate?" Clara asked. Morrison laughed bitterly. "Sheriff Brennan? He's been in Carson's pocket since the day he was elected. Investigation went nowhere, case got dropped, and I was told to let it go. Carson's got this whole region sewn up tight." "So what did you do?" "I survived. Made my ranch too expensive to destroy, too difficult to buy out. Built relationships with other ranchers, created a network Carson couldn't penetrate. It's not perfect, but I'm still here." Ethan leaned forward. "Could we do the same?" "Maybe, but it takes time, and it sounds like you don't have much of that." Morrison scratched his jaw. "What exactly are you asking for?" "Help. Supplies if you can spare them. Information about Carson's operations. Maybe some men if things get violent." "I can spare some supplies?" "Information, sure. I've been tracking Carson's moves for years. But men?" Morrison shook his head. "Most folks are too scared to cross him directly, myself included, if I'm honest. I'll help where I can, but I won't risk my own ranch for yours." It wasn't the answer Ethan wanted, but it was honest. "I understand," he said. "We'll take whatever help you're willing to give." Morrison stood. "Come on, let me show you something." He led them to his barn and pulled back a tarp, revealing a stack of lumber, bags of nails, and other building supplies. "Had these left over from when I expanded last year. You can have them. Won't be enough to rebuild your house, but it's a start." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Why are you helping us?" "Because I know what it's like to fight Carson alone, and because someone needs to stand up to that bastard eventually. Might as well be you." Morrison handed Ethan a piece of paper. "Here, names and locations of other ranchers who might be sympathetic. Can't promise they'll help, but they're worth asking." They loaded the supplies into the wagon Morrison lent them and headed back as evening fell. The temperature dropped fast, and by the time they reached their ranch, Clara's face was numb with cold. But they had lumber. They had allies, however tentative. They had hope. Over the next week, they worked like machines, using Morrison's supplies and timber salvaged from the collapsed buildings. They built a small cabin against the side of the barn, just one room, barely insulated, but it had a roof and walls and a small stove they'd cobbled together from salvaged parts. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. They visited 3 of the ranchers on Morrison's list. 2 turned them away, too frightened of Carson to get involved. The third, a widow named Eleanor Hayes, listened to their story and offered food and blankets. "I can't fight Carson openly," she said, "but I won't let you starve either. That's not Christian, regardless of what the town thinks you are." Clara wanted to correct her, wanted to explain again that she and Ethan weren't living in sin, that their relationship was complicated but not immoral, but she was too tired to argue. They took the food and blankets and went home. By the end of January, they'd settled into a new routine. Wake before dawn, tend animals, work on repairs, eat whatever meager supplies they had, sleep in the tiny cabin pressed against the barn. They took turns keeping the fire going through the night, because letting it go out meant freezing to death before morning. It was brutal, exhausting, and Clara had never felt more alive. She and Ethan existed in a strange intimacy now, sharing space, sharing work, sharing the constant danger that hung over them. They didn't talk about feelings, didn't acknowledge the way their hands lingered when they passed tools, or how Ethan always made sure she got the warmer side of the cabin, or how Clara automatically saved him the larger portion at meals. They just lived, day by day, fighting to survive. And then, on a bitter February morning, everything came to a head. Clara was in the barn when she heard riders approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. She grabbed the rifle and stepped outside. 6 men rode into the yard, all of them carrying guns. Leading them was a well-dressed man in his 50s who could only be Carson himself, Lydia's father, the man who owned half the territory. Ethan emerged from the cabin, his own rifle in hand. "Carson," he said, "didn't expect you to do your own dirty work." Carson smiled, a thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Hale, Miss Whitmore, I thought it was time we had a conversation. We've got nothing to say to you." "I think you do. See, I've been very patient, made you a fair offer for this land, even raised it after your unfortunate fire. But you keep refusing, and frankly, I'm tired of waiting." Carson gestured at the burned house, the shabby cabin. "You're clearly not capable of maintaining this property. It's an eyesore and a waste of good land." "It's my land. For now, but winter's not over yet. Lots of things can happen. People die out here all the time. Exposure, accidents, animal attacks." His meaning was clear. Clara stepped forward, rifle raised. "Get off our property." Carson's men shifted in their saddles, hands moving to their weapons. The air went tight with potential violence. "Careful, Miss Whitmore," Carson said softly. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, and you're trespassing on what will very soon be my land." "This is our land," Ethan said, "and it's staying our land. You can send your men, burn our buildings, threaten us all you want. We're not leaving. Then you're fools, both of you." Carson pulled an envelope from his coat. "Final offer, $10,000 for the land and everything on it. Take it now, or next time I come back, it'll be with the sheriff and eviction papers. I've got lawyers who can tie this property up in court for years. You'll lose everything fighting me, your money, your time, your lives. Is it really worth it?" Ethan looked at Clara. She looked back, and in that moment they both knew the answer. "Yes," Ethan said. "It's worth it." Carson's expression hardened. "So be it. You've made your choice. Don't say I didn't warn you." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following, but one of them, a younger man with cold eyes, looked back at Clara with an expression that promised violence. When they were gone, Ethan lowered his rifle. "That was a declaration of war." "I know." Clara's heart was pounding. "What do we do?" "We get ready, and we pray we're strong enough to survive what comes next." But Clara didn't pray. She'd stopped believing in divine intervention years ago. Instead, she checked her rifle, counted their ammunition, and made plans for a fight she knew was coming. Because Carson was right about one thing. They were outnumbered and outgunned. But they weren't beaten yet. They fortified what they could. Ethan nailed boards across the cabin windows, leaving only narrow gaps to see through. Clara organized their ammunition and supplies, creating caches in different locations so they wouldn't lose everything if the cabin was breached. They took shifts sleeping, one always awake and watching. The first attack came 3 nights later. Clara was on watch when she heard it, the sound of breaking glass from the barn. She grabbed her rifle and shook Ethan awake. "Someone's in the barn." They moved together through the darkness, keeping low. The barn door was open, swinging in the wind. Inside, one of the horses was screaming. Ethan rushed in and Clara followed, her rifle raised. 2 men were in the stalls, one trying to cut the horses loose, while the other poured something that smelled like kerosene along the walls. "Stop!" Ethan's voice cracked like a whip. The men spun around. One reached for his gun. Clara didn't hesitate. She fired a warning shot into the ceiling, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. "Next one goes through you," she said, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. The men exchanged glances. Then the one with the kerosene can dropped it and ran, disappearing into the night. The other followed, and Clara heard horses galloping away. "Check the animals," Ethan said, already moving to inspect the damage. The horses were terrified but unhurt. The kerosene had been poured but not lit. They'd interrupted just in time. Clara's hands shook as she put down her rifle. "They were going to burn the barn with the horses inside," she said. "I know." Ethan's face was grim. "Carson's not playing anymore. He's trying to destroy everything we have left." Then we hit back. "With what? 2 rifles and anger?" Ethan kicked the kerosene can. "We're holding on by our fingernails here, Clara. One more attack like this, and we're finished." "So we make sure there isn't another attack." Clara's mind was racing. We go to Ridgeback tomorrow. We call a town meeting and we expose Carson for what he is. They won't listen. Maybe not. But we have to try. Because if we don't, he wins. He burns us out, takes our land, and nobody ever knows the truth. Clara grabbed Ethan's arm. We have Morrison's testimony. Eleanor Hayes knows what's happening. Even Sheriff Brennan can't ignore arson and attempted murder if we make it public enough. Ethan stared at her. You realize what you're asking. We go to that town, the same people who've been calling you a whore, and we ask them to stand with us against the most powerful family in the territory? Yes, that's exactly what I'm asking. They'll laugh us out of town. Maybe, but at least we'll go down fighting. Clara's voice softened. I'm tired of hiding, Ethan. Tired of surviving by inches. If we're going to lose everything anyway, let's lose it on our terms. Standing up, speaking truth. Something shifted in Ethan's expression. All right, we do this your way, but if it goes wrong, we'll figure it out, together. The next morning, they rode to Morrison's ranch first. He listened to their plan with growing alarm. You want to call out Carson publicly? In front of the whole town? Morrison shook his head. That's suicide. It's the only move we have left, Clara said. But we need you there. Your testimony about what he did to your ranch. It'll give us credibility. I told you, I can't risk. He's going to come for you eventually anyway, Ethan cut in. You know he will. Once he's finished with us, he'll circle back to you. Maybe not this year, maybe not next, but eventually. Carson doesn't leave loose ends. Morrison's jaw worked. He looked older suddenly, worn down by years of fighting a battle he couldn't win. I'll be there, he said finally. But don't expect it to change anything. These people are scared. Fear makes them do terrible things. They gathered Eleanor Hayes next. She was more willing, her anger at Carson's tactics overriding her fear. Someone needs to stand up to that man, she said. Might as well be us. By the time they rode into Ridgeback that afternoon, Clara's nerves were strung tight as fence wire. They went straight to the church hall, the same place where the social had been held, and Ethan nailed a notice to the door. Town meeting, tonight, 7 p.m., mandatory attendance, lives at stake. People started gathering before sunset. Not because they wanted to, but because curiosity and small-town habit made it impossible to ignore such a dramatic summons. By 7 o'clock, the hall was packed. Clara stood at the front with Ethan, Morrison, and Eleanor, facing a sea of hostile, suspicious faces. Margaret Crane sat in the front row, her arms crossed. Lydia Carson sat beside her, looking amused. Sheriff Brennan stood in the back, his expression unreadable. And there, in the center of the room, like a king holding court, sat Carson himself. Ethan stepped forward. The room fell silent. Thank you for coming, he started. I know most of you would rather be anywhere else, but what I have to say affects all of you, whether you know it or not. Get on with it, someone called from the back. Ethan didn't flinch. 3 weeks ago, my house was burned down. Deliberately. Someone poured accelerant on the outside wall and lit it while Clara and I were sleeping. We barely escaped with our lives. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Last week, men broke into my barn and tried to burn it down with the horses inside. We stopped them, but barely. Ethan's voice grew harder. And 2 days ago, Carson came to my ranch with armed men and threatened us. Told us we'd die if we didn't sell. He's been trying to force me off my land for years, and he's finally escalated to murder. Carson stood smoothly, his face the picture of offended innocence. These are serious accusations, Mr. Hale. I hope you have proof. I have testimony. Ethan gestured to Morrison. Jack, tell them what Carson did to you. Morrison stood, his weathered face set. 5 years ago, Carson wanted my land. I refused to sell. 2 weeks later, my water source was poisoned. Lost 40 head of cattle. Couldn't prove who did it, but Carson had made it clear what would happen if I didn't cooperate. Circumstantial, Carson said smoothly. Tragic, certainly, but hardly proof of wrongdoing on my part. What about the fire? Clara spoke up. Her voice cut through the murmurs. What about the men who tried to burn down the barn? Are those circumstantial too? What men? Carson spread his hands. I know nothing about any fire. Perhaps it was an accident. You were living in crude conditions after all. These things happen. It wasn't an accident, and you know it. Clara stepped forward. You came to our ranch yourself, made threats, told us people die out here all the time. I made no threats. I made an offer, a generous one, which you refused, if you've been experiencing difficulties. That's unfortunate, but it has nothing to do with me. Margaret Crane stood. Perhaps if you weren't living in such scandal, the universe wouldn't be punishing you. A woman alone with a man, no marriage, no propriety. Is it any wonder bad things are happening? Several people nodded. Clara felt rage building in her chest. The only scandal here is a rich man trying to destroy people who won't bow to him, she said. Everything else, the judgment, the rumors, the pearl clutching about propriety, that's just distraction. You want to talk about sin? How about greed? How about violence? How about arson and attempted murder? These are wild accusations from a desperate woman, Lydia said, standing beside her father. Everyone knows you're not right in the head, Clara. You were rejected on that train platform, cast aside like garbage, and you've been grasping at anything ever since, including a man who's clearly too grief-stricken to see he's being manipulated. I'm not manipulating anyone, Clara shot back. I'm trying to tell the truth. Your truth, or the truth? Lydia smiled. Because from where we stand, you're a woman of questionable character making wild claims against a respected family. Why should anyone believe you? The room murmured agreement. Clara felt the moment slipping away. Then Ethan spoke, his voice cutting through the noise. Because I love her. The hall went silent. Ethan turned to face Clara, and she saw everything in his eyes, fear and courage and something that looked like surrender. I love her, he repeated louder now. Clara Whitmore is the strongest, most honest person I've ever met. She came here with nothing, worked herself to the bone keeping my ranch alive, and never once asked for anything except the chance to build a life. She's not manipulating me. She saved me. And if you can't see that, if all you can see is scandal and sin, then you're the ones who are blind. Clara's breath caught. The room erupted. This is outrageous. Living in sin and admitting it. Shameful. But Ethan wasn't done. He pulled something from his pocket, a small box Clara had never seen before. Inside was a ring, simple gold, worn with age. This was my mother's ring, he said. Sarah wore it for 8 years, and now I'm asking Clara to wear it. He turned to her fully. Marry me. Not because of propriety or what they think, or any other reason except that I love you, and I want to spend whatever time we have left fighting this fight together, as partners, as equals, as husband and wife. Clara stared at him. She was aware of the entire town watching, of Carson's calculating expression, of Lydia's fury, but all of it faded against the simple honesty in Ethan's face. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. He slipped the ring on her finger, and even through everything else, Clara felt something lock into place, a sense of rightness, of home, of finally belonging somewhere. The room exploded in noise. Some people were angry, some shocked, some, surprisingly, looked almost approving. Eleanor Hayes was wiping tears from her eyes. Carson raised his hands for silence. When he got it, his smile was cold. How touching! A proposal in the middle of baseless accusations. Quite the performance. He looked around the room. But it changes nothing. These two have no proof of their claims. They're desperate people making desperate accusations. And I, for one, won't stand here and be slandered. He started to leave. And Clara knew that if he walked out that door, they'd lost. He'd won. The town would go back to their lives, and Carson would finish what he started. Wait, she called out. You want proof? Fine. Let's talk about the note nailed to our gate calling me a whore, about the store clerk who suddenly refused us credit, about Lydia's visit where she threatened that accidents happen if we didn't leave. Hearsay, Carson said. My daughter made no such threats. I have witnesses, Clara pressed. Ethan heard every word. Of course he did. Your lover. Very credible. Carson's tone was mocking. Is this all you have? Notes? And he said she said? Clara felt desperation rising. He was right. They had testimony, but no hard proof. Nothing that would stand up against Carson's money and influence. Then Sheriff Brennan cleared his throat. Everyone turned. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, but he stepped forward. Actually, he said slowly, there might be something. Carson's expression flickered. Tom, I don't think... After the Hales filed their report, I did some checking, quiet-like. Brennan pulled out a notebook. Turns out 3 different ranchers reported suspicious fires over the last 5 years. All of them on land Carson had made offers for. All of them ruled accidents, but the pattern's there if you look for it. The room shifted. People were listening now. And last week, Brennan continued, I found these in the alley behind the general store. He held up 2 cans. Kerosene cans. Same brand as what was used at the Hale barn. They've got initials scratched on the bottom. Property of Carson Ranch. Carson's face went white. That proves nothing. Those cans could have been stolen. Could have been. But I also talked to your ranch hands. A couple of them were willing to talk, especially the younger ones who weren't so loyal. Brennan flipped a page. They confirmed you sent men to the Hale place, twice, once to burn the house, once to finish the job with the barn. The hall erupted. Carson tried to speak over the noise, but his voice was drowned out. Why didn't you tell us this before? Morrison demanded, standing. Brennan looked ashamed. Because I was scared. Carson's got power, and I didn't want to lose my position. But watching Miss Whitmore stand up here and tell the truth while I sat on evidence, he shook his head. I couldn't do it anymore. Some things are more important than keeping a job. Clara felt tears burning her eyes. Beside her, Ethan's hand found hers and squeezed. Carson was backing toward the door, his composure cracking. This is absurd. I'll have all of you brought up on charges, defamation, conspiracy. You'll do nothing, Brennan said, and his voice was harder than Clara had ever heard it. You're under arrest for arson, attempted murder, and conspiracy. You have the right to... Carson bolted. He made it 3 steps before Morrison and 2 other ranchers blocked the door. He turned, looking for another exit, and found Eleanor Hayes standing in his way. Sit down, Mr. Carson, she said quietly. It's over. He sat. And for the first time, Clara saw real fear in his eyes. The next hour was chaos. Brennan arrested Carson and 2 of his men, the ones who'd actually set the fires, identified by Brennan's investigation. Lydia screamed and threatened and finally stormed out, but without her father's power behind her, nobody paid attention. Margaret Crane was notably silent, her face pale as she processed what she'd just witnessed. When the crowd finally dispersed, Clara and Ethan stood outside the hall in the cold night air, still processing what had happened. We won, Clara said, like she couldn't quite believe it. We won, Ethan confirmed. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. You won. That was all you, calling this meeting, forcing the truth out. Brennan's the one who had the evidence. But you're the one who made him use it. You made all of us see that staying silent was worse than speaking up. Ethan pressed his forehead against hers. You're remarkable, you know that? I'm terrified, Clara admitted, and exhausted. And I still can't believe you proposed in front of the entire town. Seemed like the moment. Ethan smiled, and it reached his eyes for the first time in months. Too late to back out now. I don't want to back out. Clara looked at the ring on her finger, catching the lamplight. I want this. All of it. The ranch, the life, you. Even without a house? We'll build a house. A better one. Clara felt strength returning, the kind that came from surviving something that should have destroyed you. We'll build everything better. They married a week later in that same church hall, with Morrison and Eleanor as witnesses. Most of the town came, some out of genuine support, others out of curiosity or guilt. Margaret Crane attended and actually apologized afterward, her voice stiff but sincere. I was wrong about you, she said. I let jealousy and judgment cloud my mind. You're stronger than I gave you credit for. Clara accepted the apology, though she didn't fully trust it yet. Trust would take time. Everything would take time. But they had time now. Carson was sentenced to 15 years for arson and attempted murder. His ranch was seized to pay damages, not just to Ethan and Clara, but to the other ranchers he'd terrorized. Lydia left town entirely, and nobody heard from her again. The money from the settlement allowed them to rebuild, not just the house, but the entire ranch. They hired proper help, honest workers who weren't afraid to stand beside them. They expanded the herd, repaired all the fences, turned the failing operation into something profitable. It took 2 years of brutal work, 2 years of 18-hour days and hands that never quite stopped aching. But they did it together, and that made all the difference. The new house rose on the same foundation as the old one, but bigger, stronger. Clara designed it herself. A kitchen with proper storage, a bedroom that got morning sun, a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the land they'd fought for. On the day they moved in, Ethan carried her over the threshold like the tradition demanded, both of them laughing at the absurdity and rightness of it. "We did it," Clara said, standing in the center of their new home. "You did it," Ethan corrected. "I was just stubborn enough to hold on while you built everything around me. We did it together. That's the only way anything worth having gets done." That summer, Clara discovered she was pregnant. The news terrified and thrilled them both. They'd never discussed children, had been too focused on survival to think about the future in concrete terms. But now the future was here, real and demanding. Eleanor Hayes came to help when Clara's time came, along with a doctor from the next town over. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Clara thought she might not survive it. But she did. At dawn on a clear September morning, she brought a daughter into the world, a squalling, red-faced miracle that she and Ethan named Sarah, after the woman who'd come before. Holding her daughter, Clara thought about the train platform where this had all started. Thought about standing there rejected and humiliated, with no money and no prospects, and a whole town watching her fail. She'd come so far from that moment, not because she was perfect or special or because some higher power had intervened, but because she'd refused to accept that rejection as the end of her story. Every year on the anniversary of that day, the day she'd been thrown away like something worthless, Clara and Ethan returned to the train platform. They renewed their vows there, right where it had all begun. Not because they needed to prove anything to anyone, but because it reminded them that the worst moments of your life can become the foundation of your best ones. People who'd once judged her came to see the ranch now, came to buy cattle, to ask advice, to marvel at what she'd built. Clara didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The life she lived was proof enough. Margaret Crane became an unlikely ally, using her influence to help other women who found themselves desperate and discarded. She never became warm, exactly, but she became fair. And that was enough. The ranch prospered. More children came. 2 sons who had their father's stubbornness and their mother's determination. The land that had once been failing became one of the most successful operations in the territory. But success wasn't measured in cattle or acres or money in the bank. It was measured in the family they built, the community they fostered, the proof that being rejected doesn't mean you're worthless. Clara taught her children that lesson early. Taught them that the world would try to tell them who they were and what they deserved, and that they had the right to tell the world it was wrong. She taught them that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up when everyone expects you to stay down. She taught them that the people who throw you away are often the ones too broken to see your value. And most importantly, she taught them that home isn't a place you find. It's something you build, piece by piece, with your own scarred hands and stubborn heart. On Clara's 50th birthday, she stood on the porch of the house she'd built and looked out over land she'd fought for. Ethan stood beside her, gray now, but still strong, still hers. Their children played in the yard, grown now, starting families of their own, but still coming home. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd taken Fortner's money that day?" Ethan asked. "If you'd just gone back to Denver?" Clara considered it. "Sometimes, but not with regret. That rejection was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to stop waiting for someone to choose me and start choosing myself." "I chose you." "You did, after I chose myself first." Clara took his hand. "That's what made it work. I didn't need you to save me. I needed a partner to build something with, and that's what we did." Ethan pulled her close, and they stood there watching the sun set over their empire, the one they'd built from ashes and spite and relentless, stubborn love. Clara thought about the woman she'd been on that train platform. Desperate, ashamed, certain she was exactly what everyone said she was. Too old, too worn, not worth choosing. She wanted to go back and tell that woman what was coming. Tell her that the rejection she feared would be the beginning of everything. Tell her that being cast aside by someone who couldn't see her value would lead her to someone who could. Tell her that the town that judged her would eventually stand with her. Tell her that she was stronger than she knew, braver than she believed, and worth more than anyone had ever told her. But that woman wouldn't have believed it. She'd had to live it to know it was true. So instead, Clara stood on her porch with her husband beside her and her family around her, and her land spreading out as far as she could see, and she let herself feel it, the bone-deep satisfaction of proving everyone wrong. Not by becoming someone different, by becoming exactly who she'd always been, only louder, only fiercer, only free. The woman they threw away had built an empire, and she was just getting started.